I never planned on driving through the heart of the African savannah in the dead of night. I never imagined I would be stuck on a lonely road with nothing but my faithful dog, a few friends, and a car that kept threatening to break down. But that is exactly what happened. And to this day, I cannot shake off the memory of what we saw, what we heard, and what we felt in those endless hours. If you have ever felt your heart race while alone on a quiet stretch of highway, if you have ever sensed a presence lurking in the darkness just outside your window, then you might understand a fraction of what we went through. This is the story of that trip and the terrifying secret we uncovered. My name is Gideon. I was born and raised in a mid-sized town in East Africa, surrounded by rolling hills and sprawling grasslands. Life there was usually peaceful, with bright mornings and cool nights, the smell of roasting maize in the streets, and kids playing soccer under the setting sun. As a child, my biggest worry was when the next school break would start, or when my mother would allow me to adopt a dog. When I was 14, I finally got my wish. A neighbor's dog gave birth to a litter of puppies, and my parents let me adopt one. I named him Kobe, after a player in my favorite basketball team. At first, Kobe was tiny, with big paws that he would often trip over and a tail that never stopped wagging. He grew up with me, exploring the world by my side. Now, I'm in my 20s, and Kobe is a full-grown German Shepherd with bright eyes and a keen sense of smell. He's my companion wherever I go. My father always told me that a dog's loyalty could rival that of any friend, and over the years, Kobe has proven that true again and again. A few months ago, my friends, Daniel and Alice, and I decided to take a road trip to a distant province. Daniel is the adventurous type, always searching for hidden gems and curious places far away from tourist traps. Alice is quieter but has a sharp eye for detail. She carries a camera everywhere she goes, capturing the beauty of distant towns, wildlife, and local celebrations. I've always loved driving, and I had recently inherited an old SUV from my uncle, sturdy and reliable enough for the sometimes rough African roads. Our plan was simple. We would leave at dawn, drive through the well-known routes to catch glimpses of local markets and small villages. We would spend a night or two in a town near the border to meet an old friend of Daniel's. But if you have traveled in this region, you know that plans and reality do not always match. Roads can change from smooth tarmac to dusty dirt in a heartbeat. Rain can turn paths into muddy pits. Locals might direct you along easier routes, shortcuts, they say. Sometimes these are indeed shortcuts. Other times, they become never-ending paths that lead nowhere, with landmarks only known to people who have lived there all their lives. We should have known better. We were about to discover something not found on any map. We set off early on a Saturday. The sun was peeking over the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant reds and oranges. The air was crisp, and I could feel a swell of excitement in my chest as we drove away from home. Daniel occupied the passenger seat, fiddling with the GPS on his phone. Alice was in the back with Kobe, checking her camera settings and petting him between the ears every now and then. "Make sure you get some good shots," Daniel teased Alice. She gave him a playful grin. "Oh, I will, especially if I see animals. I'm hoping to spot some elephants or maybe a lion from a distance." Kobe let out a short bark as if in agreement, and I laughed. Kobe probably hopes to see them too, though hopefully not too close. We passed through our usual familiar territory without incident. In fact, it was peaceful. We saw morning markets with vendors selling fresh fruit, the smell of roasted groundnuts wafting in through the rolled-down windows. We laughed, exchanged stories, and played music on the car stereo. By midday, we were crossing into areas less traveled. The roads were narrower, lined with tall grass on either side. Every now and then, we would catch sight of an occasional herdsman guiding a group of cows or goats. The terrain started changing from farmland to a more wild savanna, patches of bushes and acacia trees scattered around. We stopped for lunch in a small roadside village. They had a modest food stall selling roasted maize, grilled chicken, and chapati. It felt nice to stretch our legs and let Kobe sniff around. Daniel chatted with a local man who told him about a shorter route that would allow us to shave off a few hours from our trip. According to the man, the route was a bit bumpy, but would definitely get us to the next big town before nightfall. It sounded like a good idea, at least at the time. We set off again with renewed energy after lunch. The new route wasn't on the main road. Instead, it was a dirt path branching off into the wilderness. At first, it seemed harmless enough, just a dusty track with a few bumps. I could handle it in the SUV, so I wasn't too worried. An hour in, we realized that it might not have been the best idea. The path became more uneven, dipping into shallow ditches and passing over rocky patches. Sometimes the car would rattle so hard it felt as if the doors might fall off. Yet, the view around us was incredible. Tall golden grass swaying gently, the occasional gazelle darting off in the distance, and above us the open sky that stretched on forever. We were so lost in the scenery that we didn't notice how quickly the afternoon was slipping away. The sun was already dipping low, turning orange when we saw a small sign by the road. It was too faded to read clearly, but we guessed it was the name of some village. Alice leaned forward. "Should we ask someone for directions? I don't want to be lost out here after dark." Daniel checked his phone and frowned. "No signal," he muttered. He looked up at me. "What do you think, Gid?" I glanced at the rapidly setting sun. "I think we should keep moving. We're bound to reach a village soon. We can ask for directions there." Kobe let out a whine and nosed at my arm. Perhaps he sensed my uncertainty. I scratched behind his ears. "It's okay, boy," I said, though I wasn't too sure if I believed it myself. Nightfall came faster than I expected. By the time the sky was fully dark, I had to rely on the car's headlights. The path was lit up only as far as the beams reached, and everything beyond was a wall of blackness. Occasionally, we would see pairs of glowing eyes reflecting back, probably small animals or distant wildlife. We were in the middle of nowhere. The GPS still showed no signal, and my phone battery was draining. Alice was in the back, quietly looking out the window. Daniel was fiddling with the radio, but all we got was static. Kobe had stopped whining, but he seemed restless. He stood up in the back seat, ears perked, as if listening for something we couldn't hear. We rounded a bend and saw the outline of something on the road. I slowed down, blinking in surprise. It was a large dog, scruffy and thin, standing in the center of our path, staring straight at our car. Its eyes reflected the headlights, making them glow in an eerie way. Kobe noticed it immediately and let out a low growl. I stopped the car. The strange dog did not move. It didn't bark or run away. It just watched us. Daniel said quietly, "That's odd. It looks like a stray." Alice reached out to steady Kobe. "Easy, boy," she whispered. I honked the horn once, gently. The dog cocked its head, then slowly turned and padded off the road into the darkness. My heart pounded. Something about that dog's stare felt unnatural, but we had no choice but to keep going. A few kilometers later, the path seemed to widen a bit. We saw small huts on the roadside, indicating a tiny village or settlement. Relief coursed through me. We weren't as lost as I had feared. We pulled over, hoping to find someone who could give us directions or maybe even let us stay for the night. It was close to 8 p.m. by the time we arrived at a cluster of huts. The place had no electricity, so the only light came from a few lanterns and fires. We parked the SUV near one of the huts. Daniel and I got out while Alice stayed with Kobe in the back seat. A soft wind rustled the nearby grass. We could smell smoke and hear faint chatter. A middle-aged woman emerged from one of the huts, eyeing us curiously. Her face was kind, though lined with concern. Daniel spoke first. "Good evening. We're travelers. We got lost on this road. Do you know if this leads to the main highway?" Her eyes shifted from Daniel to me, then to our car. "It can," she said in a soft voice, "but it's not safe to drive at night around here. The roads are not good and there are stories." She didn't elaborate. Instead, she gestured for us to follow her into the light of her lantern. We saw a few children peeking from behind her, wide-eyed with curiosity. "We don't want to trouble you," Daniel said, "but do you know of a place we can stay? Maybe a guest house or even a field where we can park safely?" The woman exchanged looks with a younger man who appeared behind her. He stepped forward. "There is no guest house here," he explained, "but you can rest near our huts if you wish. The next big town is about 3 hours away if you drive steadily, but the roads are dangerous in the dark." I glanced at Daniel, then back at the man. "Why are they dangerous? Is it because of thieves or—" He shook his head. "Not exactly," he said. This place has legends. Spirits roam the road at night, especially if they see strangers. We don't like to travel after dusk. My stomach twisted. I had grown up hearing tales like these, but I rarely believed them. Yet, being here in the middle of nowhere with the black sky pressing down, the idea of spirits or strange creatures felt a lot more real than it did back home. Daniel forced a polite laugh. "We understand. Thank you for the warning. Maybe we can stay in the car until morning. We don't want to impose." The woman nodded slowly, her face unreadable. "You may, but don't drive further tonight. Some roads lead nowhere. And once you leave this village, there is no other settlement for many miles." We thanked them. They offered us water and a small space by a dying fire to keep warm. Alice, who had let Kobe out of the car by now, asked for permission to walk him around, and the villagers nodded, though they seemed uneasy about letting us wander far. It was a modest place, maybe 6 or 7 huts made of mud and straw, a few goats tied to wooden stakes, and a single donkey. The villagers spoke in hushed tones, eyeing us with caution, but not hostility. They were simply wary of outsiders. We decided to sleep in the car. Daniel tried to lean his seat back. I pulled out a thin blanket for Alice, and Kobe curled up on the floor, though his ears remained alert. The village went to sleep soon after. Lanterns were extinguished, and the only sounds were the distant barking of dogs and the low hum of insects. I closed my eyes but found it hard to sleep. My mind drifted to the stories the locals had told us. Spirits on the road? It could have been a rumor to scare travelers, a folk story to keep children from wandering at night. But something about the way that stray dog had stared at us still bothered me. Then there was the uneasy feeling of the villagers themselves. They didn't seem to be lying or trying to scare us for fun. They seemed genuinely concerned. Eventually, exhaustion won me over. I must have dozed off for a while. Around midnight, I jolted awake. Kobe was standing on my lap, trembling, his ears flat against his head, and he let out a sharp bark that echoed in the darkness. My heart pounded. Alice and Daniel stirred. "What is it, boy?" Alice whispered, looking around. Outside, everything was pitch black. We couldn't see a thing. I heard a sound then, soft, almost like a whisper, somewhere near the car. Daniel rolled down the window just a crack to listen. The night air was cold. We waited, but the sound came again, a low moaning or howling, carried by the breeze. It sounded almost human, yet not quite. Kobe barked again, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night's temperature. For a moment, I considered turning on the headlights to see what might be out there, but I also had this strong feeling that I didn't want to know. The moaning tapered off into a faint sob or whimper, and then it was gone. We waited for several minutes, tense and on edge. Then, silence. Eventually, we managed to fall back into a fitful sleep. Morning arrived with a soft glow of light. The villagers were up at dawn, tending to their goats and preparing fires for breakfast. We emerged from the car, stiff from our cramped positions. The villagers greeted us politely, though they seemed even more cautious now. A few children pointed at Kobe, whispering in their local language. The dog, for his part, seemed calm again, as if the night's terror had been a bad dream. Daniel pulled me aside. I was thinking, maybe we should just stay here another day and leave tomorrow morning. That way, we can explore the area in daylight and make sure we know the route. I was tempted to agree, but we were on a schedule. I was supposed to meet my cousin in the next town by evening. Let's at least see if we can make it by daytime. If it's 3 hours away, we could still get there well before dark. We talked to the younger man from the previous night. He was willing to give us directions. He drew in the dirt with a stick, marking certain roads and a small river crossing. The path he showed us was different from what we had planned. It wound around a set of hills and would eventually connect us back to the main highway. The man warned us again, make sure you leave early and do not travel these roads at dusk. It may take longer than you think. We thanked him and gave the villagers some money in return for their help. They accepted it politely, but did not smile. Before we left, the woman from last night approached us, placing a small beaded charm in my hand. "For safety," she said simply, then turned and walked away. We piled into the SUV, hearts a bit heavy from the strange atmosphere. I started the engine, and we drove out of the small village, waving goodbye to the few children who dared to come close to see us off. The sky was a clear blue, promising a bright day, and for a moment, I wondered if the fears we felt during the night were just illusions caused by the darkness and our own tired minds. But the day would prove to hold its own dangers. Following the man's directions, we drove for about an hour. The road was even more bumpy than before. At times, the dirt path would vanish, and we had to guess our way around thorny bushes and uneven terrain. We kept heading north, using the hills in the distance as a guide. Around midday, we reached the river the man had mentioned. It wasn't very wide, but the water looked deep, and there was no bridge. Instead, a series of large rocks formed a sort of makeshift crossing. Daniel got out to check how stable the rocks were while I kept the engine running. Alice, from the back seat, eyed the crossing. "Do you really think we can drive over that?" Daniel carefully tested the first rock with his foot. "It's slippery," he noted, "but maybe with four-wheel drive we can manage, or we can look for a spot that's shallower." We walked along the river's edge, looking for a better place to cross. Kobe bounded ahead, sniffing at reeds and wagging his tail. His carefree attitude lifted my spirits, at least for a moment. Finally, we found a portion of the river that was shallow enough for the SUV, though the current was fast. We decided to risk it. I slowly eased the car down the slope, water lapping at the tires, and we inched our way across. For a tense minute, I feared the water would push us downstream, but the SUV held steady. We reached the other side with water dripping from the tires and relief filling our lungs. Alice breathed out. "I really hope we're almost at the main road. This trip is turning into an ordeal." Kobe barked as if to say he agreed and hopped back into the car. 2 hours passed with only the occasional sign of life, a distant farmhouse, a small gathering of goats under a tree, or a hawk circling overhead. We were still confident we'd hit the main road soon. The idea of a smooth highway and a proper meal was all I could think about. Then we saw a figure ahead of us, standing in the middle of the road. At first, we couldn't tell who or what it was, just a shape against the bright daylight. As we got closer, we realized it was a young man, probably in his early 20s. He wore dusty clothes and had a tired look about him. He waved us down as we approached. I slowed to a stop. Daniel rolled down the window to speak to him. "Hey there, are you okay?" He wiped sweat from his forehead and nodded. "Yes, my motorcycle broke down a few miles back. I was walking, trying to find a village." His accent was different. Maybe he was from another region. "Do you know if there's a settlement nearby?" Daniel and I exchanged a glance. "We came from a small village," Daniel said, pointing in the direction we'd come. "It's at least a couple of hours that way. Not sure about ahead. We were told the main highway is in that direction." Daniel pointed forward. The young man looked anxious. "I have been walking for hours. You haven't seen any other travelers or any sign of a town?" Alice leaned forward. "No, we haven't, but we can give you a lift if you want." He hesitated, glancing at the car. It was then he noticed Kobe. "Is your dog friendly?" he asked. I nodded. "He won't bite unless he feels threatened." The young man sighed in relief. "I'd appreciate a ride," he said softly. "I don't want to be caught out here at night." He climbed into the back seat next to Alice, carefully avoiding touching Kobe, who was now watching him with mild curiosity. Daniel turned to look at him. "What's your name?" "Samuel," the young man replied. "Thank you for stopping. Not everyone would." I started driving again. "Where are you heading?" He shrugged. "I was on my way to see some family in the next province, but I got lost. My motorbike broke down, and I had no idea where I was. My phone died too." As we drove, we shared bits of our journey. When we mentioned the eerie feeling at night and the stories the villagers told us, Samuel grew quiet. After a moment, he spoke, his voice subdued. "My grandfather used to tell me stories about this region," he said. "He said there's an ancient spirit here that appears at night on lonely roads. It takes different forms: a lost traveler, a crying child, a stray dog. When people stop to help, they vanish." A chill ran through me. "A stray dog?" I repeated, thinking of the one we'd seen the night before. Samuel nodded. "Yes, that's what he used to say. One must never stop for a lone dog at night around here. It might not be a real dog." Kobe let out a small whine, and I found myself patting him for comfort as much as to soothe him. Daniel cleared his throat. Well, good thing we haven't seen anything like that, right, Gid? I forced a chuckle. Yeah, good thing. But my mind wouldn't let go of the memory of that dog standing in the middle of the road. Could it have been the same spirit Samuel was talking about? Alice's voice wavered slightly. You said it might also appear as a crying child or a lost traveler, like someone alone at night. How do we know who to trust? Samuel shrugged, looking uneasy. I don't know. My grandfather said that you feel it if it's not human, an unsettling feeling, a chill in your bones. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. All of us fell silent. The only sound was the rumbling of the SUV and the drone of the tires on the uneven surface. We pressed on for another hour with no signs of the highway. The day was growing late again. My anxiety spiked each time the car jolted over a pothole. We were running out of time to find proper shelter before night fell. I glanced at Samuel in the rearview mirror. He seemed worried too. He must have been exhausted from his ordeal. Just as the sun dipped low, we spotted something on the horizon, a small structure. Our hopes soared, thinking it might be a roadside shop or a petrol station. As we got closer, however, we realized it was an abandoned building. The roof was partially caved in, the windows shattered. Still, it was shelter. Perhaps we could spend the night there instead of sleeping in the car. We parked near the entrance. The place looked like it had once been a trading post or a rest stop for travelers. Broken tables and chairs lay scattered inside, covered with dust and cobwebs. Doors were missing or hanging off their hinges. A few rusted signs, in a language I didn't recognize, were nailed to the walls. Kobe was uneasy again, sniffing at the doorway and letting out a low growl. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, but he just stared into the darkness of the abandoned building. Samuel peered inside. Better than staying on the road, I guess. Alice stepped gingerly over some broken glass. At least we'll be out of the wind if it gets cold. Daniel fiddled with a flashlight, shining it into corners. Seems empty. We decided to gather some dry wood from the area and start a small fire in what used to be a fireplace inside the trading post. Alice found an old metal drum that we could use as a makeshift fire pit. Soon enough, the flickering light brought some warmth to the eerie interior. Night fell once again, shrouding everything beyond the broken windows in impenetrable darkness. Our circle around the fire was small and tense. The earlier conversation with Samuel about spirits on the road had gotten under all our skins. We found ourselves jumping at the slightest sound. Kobe suddenly stood up, ears pricked. Then we heard it, footsteps crunching on gravel outside. We all froze, exchanging nervous glances. Daniel grabbed the flashlight and carefully moved toward the entrance. I followed close behind, heart pounding. "Hello?" Daniel called out. Silence. Then the footsteps started again, circling around the building. A slow, deliberate crunch, 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 as if someone was walking with measured steps. Samuel's face was pale. Alice picked up a piece of wood from the fire, holding it like a torch. Kobe growled, the low rumble deep in his throat. Daniel pointed the flashlight outside. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing only scattered debris and tall grass. The footsteps stopped. My pulse thundered in my ears. Just as we were about to back away, a figure emerged into the edge of the flashlight's glow. My stomach twisted. It was the same stray dog from the road. Scruffy, thin, eyes glowing in the beam. It stood there, head lowered as if studying us. Kobe went wild, barking and straining forward. The stray dog bared its teeth in a silent snarl, then darted away into the darkness. Before we could relax, we heard more footsteps, this time from the opposite side of the building. Daniel swung the flashlight around, but we saw nothing. We only heard the sound, circling us, scuffing the ground like slow, dragging feet. It was as if multiple unseen figures were walking around the building, taking turns to appear and vanish. Alice let out a stifled cry. "Let's get in the car and lock the doors." None of us disagreed. We scrambled back into the building, grabbed whatever we could, then ran to the SUV. I jumped into the driver's seat and started the engine, my hands shaking. The headlights cut across the deserted trading post. We saw nothing but the swirl of dust kicked up by our own car. I threw it into gear and floored it, heading back the way we had come. The building disappeared behind us, swallowed by darkness. My chest was tight with dread. I had no idea where we were going now, just away from there. We didn't speak for a few minutes. All we heard was the roar of the engine as we sped across the dirt track. My head was throbbing with questions. What if the villagers had been right? What if the stories about spirits weren't just tales? Kobe whimpered softly, resting his head on my shoulder from the back seat. Even that small act of comfort barely eased my fear. Daniel kept checking behind us, shining his flashlight out the back window as if he expected to see something chasing us. Eventually, the road began to climb up a small hill. Rocks littered the slope, and I had to slow down to navigate around them. The sky above was a moonless black, speckled with stars that offered no real light. I relied solely on the headlights, which illuminated the path a few meters ahead and nothing more. Halfway up, the engine sputtered. My heart lurched. "No, no, no," I muttered, pressing the gas pedal harder, but it sputtered again, then died. The car rolled to a stop. Alice let out a frightened gasp. "What's wrong with it?" I turned the key again, but the engine only made a clicking sound. It might have been the battery, or the fuel pump, or something else entirely. Daniel swore under his breath. Samuel looked around anxiously. "We're stranded?" Before I could answer, we all heard it, a long, mournful howl. At first, I thought it might be a hyena or some distant animal, but then it shifted in pitch, growing more like a wailing cry of a person. A chill spread through my veins. It came from somewhere below, near the base of the hill we had just climbed. Kobe growled, pressing himself against the back window. Daniel tried the key again, more frantic this time. Still nothing. Alice reached for her phone, but there was no signal out here. Then, headlights appeared behind us, a single bright beam. Relief washed over me. Someone else was on this road. Maybe they could help us jumpstart the car or give us a ride. We waited, eyes glued to the rearview mirror, but the beam didn't get closer. It just stayed there, a glowing orb at the bottom of the hill. "Why are they stopping?" Alice whispered, eyes wide. "I don't know," I muttered, trying the ignition again and again. Still no luck. We watched for what felt like minutes, though it might have been only a few seconds. The single headlight slowly began to move up the hill, but oddly it was weaving slightly as if the vehicle was unsteady. Could it be a motorcycle? Samuel drew in a sharp breath. "Wait a minute, I left my motorcycle on a different road. This can't be." His voice died as the beam got closer. Indeed, it looked like a motorcycle headlight, but there was something off about the angle. It bobbed up and down, not at the height a motorcycle's light would be. It was almost as if someone was carrying a lantern, yet it was white and harsh, like an electric bulb. We stared, fear gripping us as the light approached. My throat went dry. Something about it felt wrong, like it wasn't from a normal bike or lantern. Kobe barked furiously, almost leaping into the front seat. The light came close enough for us to see a shape in its glare, a tall, thin figure. No bike, no vehicle, just a figure striding up the hill with a blazing white light floating or held out in front of them. Alice screamed, "Go, go, go!" Daniel twisted the key again, and by some miracle, the engine roared to life. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, and the SUV lunged forward, cresting the hill. The last glimpse I caught in the side mirror was that single blinding light, shining on a face I couldn't quite see, but I knew it was looking right at us. We sped down the other side of the hill, nearly losing control on the rocky slope. The SUV bounced and jerked, but I refused to let up on the accelerator. My only thought was to put as much distance as possible between us and that light. When we reached flatter ground, I slowed just enough to avoid flipping the car. The night stretched ahead in an endless plain of darkness. My eyes stung from straining to see the road. Alice was on the verge of tears. That thing! What was that?" No one answered. There was no logical explanation. The fear in the car was almost tangible. Even Samuel, who had seen his share of hardships, looked close to panic. For the next 20 minutes, we drove in near silence, occasionally hearing strange cries or howls in the distance. Every time, my heart jumped. Finally, we saw something that gave us a glimmer of hope, a reflective road sign. The letters were faint in the headlights, but it looked like an official sign marking the boundary of a government-protected area. If there was a sign, there might be a more frequented road nearby. I followed the direction indicated by the arrow on the sign, which pointed to a gravel road to the left. To our immense relief, the gravel soon turned into worn tarmac. We were on an actual paved road again. It still felt deserted, but at least it was a step closer to civilization. We continued driving, scanning the horizon. Then, like a blessing from above, we spotted the glow of electric lights in the distance. I almost cried with relief. A small town, maybe not big, but enough to have a working phone or a place to rest. It was well past midnight when we rolled into the town. The streets were quiet, most shops closed, but a few streetlights cast pale yellow pools on the sidewalks. We found a small guest house with a faded sign and an open gate. I parked in front and we all hurried inside, exhausted and shaken. A sleepy night watchman sat by the entrance. He seemed surprised to see us arrive at such a late hour, but led us to a vacant room without asking too many questions. As soon as we got in, Alice locked the door. Kobe flopped onto the floor, panting, but he still kept his eyes on the door, ears raised. We collapsed on the beds, adrenaline giving way to overwhelming tiredness. Daniel and I took a moment to check the car from the guest house window. No strange lights or figures followed us. Outside, the quiet street was empty. None of us slept well. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw that single bright headlight weaving up the hill. I heard the footsteps and the snarling dog. I wondered if in the morning it would all feel like a dream, but deep down, I knew it was real. Daybreak found us huddled around a small table in the guest house courtyard. The sun felt warm and comforting, yet our hearts were still heavy with last night's terror. We drank hot chai offered by the watchman and nibbled on some bread. Daniel broke the silence first. "So, are we going to talk about what happened?" Alice shuddered. "I don't know if I even believe it myself. That wasn't normal. That wasn't human." Samuel rubbed his face with trembling hands. My grandfather's stories were never so vivid. I used to laugh at them. Now, he trailed off, looking haunted. I stroked Kobe's fur, finding comfort in the dog's presence. Whatever it was, I don't want to experience it again. We asked the guest house owner if there was a mechanic in town who could look at our car. He directed us to a small garage a few streets away. The mechanic, a tall man in oil-stained overalls, listened as I described how the engine had died on the hill. He shrugged, saying it might be a clogged fuel line or a failing alternator. "I'll check," he said simply. While he worked, Daniel, Alice, Samuel, and I strolled through the town's dusty streets. We stumbled upon a small roadside cafe where we ordered more tea and some snacks. Even in the bright light of day, the memory of last night didn't fade. At the cafe, we struck up a conversation with an older man who seemed curious about us. We told him in vague terms that we got lost in the back roads. His face turned grim. "You come from that direction?" he asked, pointing with a shaky finger. When we nodded, he leaned in. "Many years ago," he said, voice low, "there was an old trade route that passed through those lands. People used to travel with goods, sometimes by donkey or camel. But the route was abandoned because travelers kept disappearing. Some said bandits got them, others said wild animals. But the survivors told strange stories, like you did. Strange lights at night, wailing voices, illusions of children crying on the road. It's as if the land itself doesn't want visitors." A chill went down my spine. The old man shook his head. "Be grateful you made it out." We left the cafe feeling both validated and more unsettled. Now we knew local legends matched exactly what we had seen. Back at the garage, the mechanic told us we needed a part that wouldn't arrive until the next morning. We decided to stay one more night at the guest house. Samuel was torn. He wanted to continue on his journey, but he had no working motorcycle and very little money. Daniel insisted we help him out. "You can come with us as far as we're going," Daniel said. "We owe you that much after the night we just had together." Samuel nodded gratefully. "Thank you." That evening, we stayed close to the guest house. Alice fiddled with her camera, looking at the pictures she'd taken. Most were of the earlier parts of the trip. Sunlit savannah, the river crossing, a few selfies in the car. Nothing from the horrors of the night, except one strange shot from inside the abandoned trading post. A blurry image near the broken window, almost like a face, though it might have been just shadows and dust. We decided not to dwell on it. Instead, we tried to lift our spirits. We told funny stories from our childhoods, teased each other, and played with Kobe, who seemed happy now that we were safe. But deep inside, we all felt a weight, as if the events of the previous night would never fully leave us. Morning came and the mechanic fixed the SUV. We paid him, grateful for his help. The rest of the drive to the next major town was blessedly uneventful. We stuck to well-traveled roads, passing other cars and trucks. It was almost a shock to see normal life going on. People selling goods at roadside stands, kids riding bikes, men loading sacks onto lorries. The sun shone, the birds chirped, and the sky was a serene blue. By late afternoon, we arrived at our planned destination, a bigger town with proper hotels and decent roads. We parted ways with Samuel there. Daniel gave him some money so he could find transportation or fix his motorcycle. "Keep in touch," Daniel told him, scribbling down our phone numbers. Samuel nodded, eyes filled with gratitude. "I will, and thank you for believing me and for saving me in a way." We watched him walk off, blending into the busy crowd. For a long moment, none of us said a word. Then with heavy sighs, we loaded back into the car. Alice touched my shoulder. "Do you think we'll ever be able to forget?" I glanced at Kobe, who stared back at me with trusting eyes. "No," I said quietly, "and maybe we shouldn't. Some things shouldn't be forgotten." Our trip continued for a few more days, though it was overshadowed by what had happened. Even though we were on safer, busier roads, my heart pounded each time dusk approached. We never again stayed in such remote villages or attempted any shortcut. The fear of the unknown had taken root in us. When we finally got back to our hometown, it felt like emerging from a bad dream. Familiar streets, friendly neighbors, the comfort of my own bed, they all seemed precious in a way they hadn't before. My parents welcomed us with hugs and laughter, completely unaware of the terror we had faced. We gave them a brief version of the story, omitting the supernatural parts. They chalked it up to rough roads and bad luck. But Daniel, Alice, and I knew better. Late one night, a week after we returned, the three of us sat in my room with Kobe at our feet. We tried to make sense of it all. We speculated on whether it was some sort of shared hallucination, or if we had crossed paths with something truly supernatural. None of us had concrete answers. But we all agreed on one thing. We wouldn't go bragging about it or trying to prove it. We felt it was safer to keep it to ourselves, at least for the time being. Life eventually returned to a semblance of normal. We went back to our routines, jobs, family gatherings, weekend hangouts. Yet some nights when the wind howls or a dog barks in the distance, I'm transported back to that dark Savannah road. I see the stray dog with glowing eyes, the faint footsteps circling the trading post, the single headlight climbing the hill with no rider or motorcycle attached. Kobe, my loyal companion, hasn't changed much. He still wags his tail every morning, excited for a walk. But once in a while, he will stare off into the distance, ears perked, and let out a low growl. In those moments, I wonder if he senses something I can't. Daniel no longer suggests random shortcuts when we travel. Alice keeps her camera by her side, but she never again tries to take pictures at night in a deserted place. As for me, I still love road trips, but I plan them carefully. I research the routes, stick to main roads, and never drive after sunset in unfamiliar territory. Sometimes I think about those lost travelers the villagers mentioned. Did they vanish because of normal dangers like bandits or wild animals? Or did they fall victim to the same presence we encountered? The stories of shape-shifting spirits, of illusions that lure travelers to their doom, are still told in whispers across the land. When I see someone about to set off on a long journey through remote areas, I have only one piece of advice. Don't underestimate the roads at night. There are places where fear lurks in the darkness, places where logic and reason struggle to hold ground. You might think it's all legends and myths until you find yourself alone in the pitch-black wild, hearing footsteps just beyond your vision, seeing lights where there should be none. And if you ever see a stray dog standing still in the center of the road at night, staring at you with glowing eyes, think twice before you stop. Sometimes, kindness can be a trap. Sometimes the simplest decision can lead you down a path of no return. I have told you my story. It isn't meant to frighten you away from traveling or to make you distrustful of strangers. But it is a warning. Some roads hold secrets older than any of us. If you choose to wander them, respect them, fear them even. Because once you cross that line between the known and the unknown, you may find yourself face to face with something beyond imagination. For us, the nightmares still come, but they fade with time. I only hope that by sharing our experience, I can help others avoid the same terror. Maybe then, what we went through will serve a purpose beyond haunting our memories.